long before satellites linked the planet together, before jet engines drew white lines across the upper atmosphere. Flight was still an uncertain experiment. Aircraft were built from wood and stretched fabric. Their engines rattled and sputtered like farm machinery lifted into the air. Yet above the battlefields of the First World War, those fragile machines created something the world had never seen before. The sky became a new kind of frontier, and the men who flew there became a new kind of warrior. Among them was a pilot who had once chased speed on dusty racetracks, a mechanic's son who understood machines not as puzzles but as partners. His name was Captain Eddie Rickenbacker. He would become the leading American flying ace of the First World War, credited with 26 victories in the air. Later, he would help shape the future of commercial aviation. And during the Second World War, he would survive a remarkable 21-day ordeal, drifting across the Pacific Ocean. His story is not simply one of triumph. It is a story of risk, resilience, and a century in which technology changed human life with astonishing speed. In that transformation, ordinary people sometimes found themselves at the center of history. For Rickenbacker, it began in a world where flight was still new, uncertain, and often frightening. In 1890, the United States stood between two eras. Steam trains crossed the continent, factories darkened the skies of growing cities, and electricity was only beginning to appear in homes. Automobiles were still experimental machines. For most people, travel remained as slow as the horse. In Columbus, Ohio, Edward Vernon Rickenbacker was born into this changing world. His father, Wilhelm Rickenbacker, had emigrated from Switzerland in search of opportunity. Like many immigrants of the time, he worked with his hands and built a life gradually in his new country. Over the years, the family name shifted slightly from Rickenbacker to Rickenbacker, but its origins remained tied to that journey across the Atlantic. Eddie's early life was shaped by hardship. When he was 12 years old, his father was killed in a construction accident. The loss forced the young boy into adulthood almost overnight. School ended, and work began. He found employment wherever he could. In a glass factory, a metal shop, and as an apprentice mechanic. The work was demanding, but it revealed something important about him. Eddie had a natural instinct for machinery. He could listen to an engine and notice problems others missed. Bolts, gears, and pistons were not abstract designs to him. They were systems he could understand through sound, touch, and experience. By the early years of the 20th century, the automobile industry was expanding quickly across the United States. Cars were beginning to represent a new kind of freedom and speed. Nowhere was that excitement more visible than on the racetrack. Auto racing in the early 1900s was intense and unpredictable. Drivers operated powerful machines with almost no safety protections. Tires could burst without warning. Steering mechanisms sometimes failed. Accidents were not uncommon. Yet the danger was part of the attraction. Large crowds gathered to watch these early racing machines thunder across dusty fairgrounds and wooden board tracks. Drivers became some of the first celebrities of the mechanical age. Eddie Rickenbacker entered that world as a mechanic. But before long, he wanted more than to repair engines. He wanted to drive. By the 1910s, Rickenbacker had become one of America's respected racing drivers. He competed in major events, including the famous Indianapolis 500. His reputation grew as a competitor who combined speed with discipline and mechanical knowledge. Racing required precision. Every movement mattered. A single mistake could send a car into the barriers or spinning across the track at high speed. Even as automobiles captured the imagination of the public, another invention was beginning to reshape the future: the airplane. Only a decade earlier, in 1903, the Wright brothers' first flight had lasted just 12 seconds above the sand dunes of North Carolina. But progress came quickly. Engineers refined engines, strengthened wings, and experimented with new designs. Within a few years, the possibilities of human flight began to expand. When war broke out in Europe in 1914, aircraft were still relatively simple machines. At first, they were used mainly for observation. Pilots flew over enemy lines to photograph troop positions and track movements on the ground. Their aircraft carried cameras and maps rather than weapons. But war has always accelerated invention. Soon pilots began carrying pistols, then rifles. Eventually machine guns were mounted directly onto the aircraft. The sky itself had become part of the battlefield. When the United States entered the conflict in 1917, aerial combat was already a defining feature of modern warfare. Dogfights between fighter aircraft, tight, spiraling duels high above the trenches, had become both dangerous and dramatic. For Eddie Rickenbacker, the war offered something more than a call to service. It offered a chance to enter the newest frontier of speed and machinery. But his path into aviation was not immediate. At 27 years old, he was older than many recruits. The military first assigned him to mechanical work with the American Expeditionary Forces, maintaining vehicles and aircraft. For a man who had raced at some of the fastest speeds in America, the assignment was frustrating. Still, Rickenbacker recognized an opportunity. He studied aircraft engines carefully. He observed pilots and their routines. He learned how these fragile machines functioned and how they failed. Eventually, his persistence paid off. He was accepted into flight training. Learning to fly in 1917 bore little resemblance to modern aviation. Training aircraft were delicate and sometimes unreliable. Cockpits had very few instruments. Pilots navigated largely by recognizing landmarks below them. Crashes were common. But Rickenbacker adapted quickly. Years of racing had sharpened his reflexes and taught him how machines behaved under stress. The cockpit became another arena of competition. Only, now the stakes were measured in altitude and survival. By early 1918, he was assigned to the 94th Aero Squadron of the United States Army Air Service. Their insignia was distinctive, a red hat placed inside a white ring. The unit soon became known simply as the Hat in the Ring. The squadron flew French-built fighter aircraft, first the Nieuport and later the more powerful SPAD-13. These planes were capable of impressive speed and maneuverability for their time. Below them stretched the Western Front, a long line of trenches cutting across farmland and villages. Artillery had reshaped the landscape. Entire towns had disappeared. Yet high above that devastation, another conflict was unfolding. Pilots hunted one another in the open sky. Aerial combat during the First World War was both personal and unpredictable. Aircraft often passed close enough for pilots to see their opponents clearly. Machine guns fired in short bursts as planes twisted through the air. There were no parachutes for most of the war. If an aircraft was badly damaged, escape was unlikely. Rickenbacker approached combat with the mindset of both racer and mechanic. Preparation mattered. He studied enemy aircraft carefully and memorized their strengths and weaknesses. Before each mission, he inspected his own machine. Then came the moment that marked his arrival as a fighter pilot. On April 29, 1918, Rickenbacker achieved his first aerial victory, shooting down a German False fighter over France. In the language of aerial warfare, victories were counted carefully. A pilot who shot down 5 enemy aircraft earned the title of ace. It was a distinction that carried prestige and often public recognition. But every victory also represented a life lost in the sky. Rickenbacker's success grew quickly. Over the following months, he flew patrol after patrol, encountering German fighters in tense engagements above the front. His style was controlled and deliberate. He avoided unnecessary risks and waited for opportunities where he could act decisively. Gradually, the victories accumulated. 5, 10, 15. With each engagement, his reputation grew, yet the danger remained constant. Aviation in 1918 was still an uncertain science. Engines sometimes failed without warning. Aircraft structures could break under stress. Anti-aircraft fire added another layer of risk. Every mission required flying over hostile territory. On September 25, 1918, during the massive Meuse-Gorn offensive, Rickenbacker faced one of the most difficult moments of his career. Flying alone, he encountered a group of 7 German aircraft. Many pilots might have turned away. Rickenbacker chose to engage. In a tense aerial battle, he maneuvered among the opposing fighters and fired several short bursts from his machine guns. When the encounter ended, 2 enemy aircraft had been brought down, and he had managed to return safely. The action later became one of the reasons he was awarded the Medal of Honor. By the end of the war, Rickenbacker had been credited with 26 aerial victories, more than any other American pilot. He was now recognized as the leading American ace of the First World War. Yet behind that achievement was a sobering truth. Many pilots never survived long enough to gain such recognition. Aircraft failures, enemy fire, and the hazards of early aviation claimed many lives. Each mission carried uncertainty. The war ended in November 1918 with the armistice of November 11, 1918. After 4 years of conflict, the guns finally fell silent. The cost had been enormous. Millions had died, and several empires had collapsed. But one technology had emerged with new importance. The airplane, what had once been an experimental invention, had become a powerful tool with enormous potential. For Eddie Rickenbacker, the war changed everything. He was no longer known simply as a race car driver. He had become a national figure. Yet the end of the war raised a new question. What role would aviation play in a world no longer dominated by combat? The answer began to take shape. During the 1920s and 1930s, aviation slowly shifted from military use toward commercial transportation. Aircraft were increasingly used to carry passengers and mail between cities. The vision was ambitious. Flying remained expensive and sometimes uncomfortable. Aircraft had limited range. Weather forecasting was still developing, and navigation methods were basic. Even so, aviation pioneers believed the future of travel would eventually move into the sky. Rickenbacker became one of the leaders of that effort. In 1938, he took charge of Eastern Airlines, a growing American airline. Under his leadership, the company expanded steadily. Aircraft technology improved, and airlines began building reliable route networks across the United States. Rickenbacker emphasized efficiency and safety. To him, aviation was not simply about adventure. It was about creating dependable systems that people could trust. Gradually, more passengers chose to travel by air. Business trips that once required days by train could now be completed much faster. The sky was becoming a new transportation network. Yet as aviation advanced, the world moved again toward global conflict. In 1939, the German invasion of Poland began the war that would become World War II. Air power now played a central role in modern warfare. Aircraft were faster, stronger, and capable of carrying heavier equipment than their predecessors. In 1918, although Rickenbacker was no longer a combat pilot, his experience remained valuable. In 1942, he was sent on a mission across the Pacific to inspect military operations and deliver messages between commanders. The journey began routinely, but it soon turned into an extraordinary test of endurance. On October 21, 1942, Rickenbacker and 7 others boarded a B-17 aircraft departing from Hawaii. Their destination was a remote airfield in the Pacific. Navigation difficulties soon pushed the aircraft far off its intended course. Fuel began to run dangerously low. Below them stretched nothing but open ocean. Eventually, the crew faced an unavoidable decision. They would have to ditch the aircraft at sea. The landing was rough, but remarkably all 8 men survived. They climbed into small life rafts floating on the Pacific. What followed was a slow and difficult struggle for survival. The men had very little water and only a small amount of food. Day after day, they drifted across open water. The sun was intense during daylight hours, while nights brought cold winds and darkness. They rationed every drop of water and collected rain whenever possible. Occasionally, they caught fish or seabirds that landed nearby. One well-known moment occurred when a seagull settled briefly on Rickenbacker's head. He managed to capture it, providing food for the group and bait for fishing. Small moments like that helped sustain them. For 21 days, the men drifted across the ocean, carried by currents and determination. Finally, on November 11, 1942, a U.S. Navy aircraft spotted the rafts. The survivors were rescued. The story spread quickly through newspapers around the world. Eddie Rickenbacker had survived combat in the skies over Europe and, now an ordeal at sea in the Pacific. In the years after the war, aviation advanced at remarkable speed. Jet engines gradually replaced propellers. Aircraft crossed oceans in a matter of hours. Airports became major gateways connecting cities and continents. Many of the practices that shaped modern aviation, careful maintenance, operational discipline, and strong airline management, had been influenced by pioneers like Rickenbacker. He remained involved with Eastern Airlines until the late 1950s, guiding the company through a crucial period of development. Yet his life also reflected something broader. He had been born when flight was barely possible. By the time he died in 1973, humanity had already reached the moon during the Apollo 11 moon landing. That transformation, from fragile biplanes to spacecraft, had occurred within a single lifetime. Rickenbacker's story sits directly within that remarkable era of change. He belonged to a generation that stepped into a new technological age without knowing exactly where it would lead. The pilots of the First World War could not fully imagine the future their machines would help create. A world of global air travel, rapid transportation across continents, a planet connected through the sky. Their fragile aircraft opened a path that humanity would continue to follow. In many ways, that is the lasting meaning of Eddie Rickenbacker's life. He pursued speed. He understood machines. He endured moments when survival depended on determination alone. But more than anything, he lived at a turning point in history, when the sky stopped being a boundary and began to feel like a road. Today, aircraft cross the world's air routes every hour. Passengers sit comfortably in their seats, traveling between continents in a matter of hours. Few think about how recent that possibility truly is. Yet somewhere behind that modern network lies the story of a race car driver who became a wartime pilot, an aviation pioneer, and a survivor of the open sea, a man who lived through the earliest days of flight, and who helped prove that once humanity learns to fly, the horizon begins to move farther away.